Welcome to this panel discussion presented by the Hexagram Network. My name is Marc-Henri Cossette. I'm a doctoral researcher at Concordia University, and I'm studying the relation between artificial intelligence and embodiment. Today, I have the privilege to host this session, and we receive three very important researchers at the forefront of research creation, both in Canada and internationally. So today we have with us Angélique Wilkie. Angélique is a performer, singer, dramaturge, and pedagogue amongst the most sought-after contemporary technique teacher on the European professional circuit. Established in Montreal, Canada since 2014, Angélique is currently Associate Professor of Contemporary Dance at Concordia University and co-director of Le Parc, a research cluster focusing on performance art. Welcome with us, Angélique.
Hi, how are you?
We also have David Rockerby. David is an internationally renowned new media artist, electronic, video, and installation artist who has been exploring human relationship with digital machines for over 35 years. He has received numerous awards for his research and artistic work and is now the director of the BMO Lab, a center engaged in the creative research in the arts performance, emerging technologies, and AI at the University of Toronto. Welcome once again with us, David.
Thank you.
And we have with us Christopher Salter. Chris Salter is an artist, professor of computation art at Concordia University. His work has been shown at major international exhibitions and festivals, and he's a regular presenter at national and international conferences. Chris Salter is also the co-director of the Hexagram Network, director of Hexagram Concordia, and associate director of Media Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology. Welcome with us again.
Thanks.
So for the next hour, we'll engage with our guests in an open discussion on the relation between the body and the machine. This will be an open discussion, so at any time, if you have a question or want to intervene, please don't hesitate to do so. Just for a quick reminder for everyone who is watching on Swapcard, this session was pre-recorded. However, if you want to interact with our guests, you can do so via the chat, and we'll be happy to answer you. All right, without further ado, let's jump right in with our first question. And I'd like to kind of start with a roundtable question. Many at home probably have seen your work in international exhibitions or have read your academic contributions. But I'd like you to describe your artistic practice and more specifically, the place of the human body, the moving body in your practice. Let's start with Angélique.
Okay, the place of the moving body in my practice, I can go as coming from a dance background. It's clear that without the moving body, for me, there is no practice. It is also, I mean, I think more than saying that it's the artistic content as well as vehicle. It is also, for me, even from a research perspective, it is the lens through which I understand. You know, I really think of the body as my thinking tool in as much as it is my creative tool. I could keep yakking, but maybe let's get, I mean, snippet responses from everybody, and then I can dive in one more time.
That sounds very good. David?
Okay, well, it's a very big question, and I'll come up with a very specific answer from a very particular angle, which is that I think my relationship to the moving body, and initially my moving body, and technology came about when I first started to play around with computers in the early 80s, and immediately felt the fact that it was not addressing my body, and that was already a problem I had myself. There was a kind of, I was having my own battle with my body, and so curiously, I found ways to use the technology as a way to reaffirm my moving body in space. Kind of inverting what I felt the computer was doing, saying, no, we can turn this upside down. We can make the body, we can make the computer make your body more present in, and so that was the start of a lot of experimentation.
Interesting. And Chris?
So I think a lot of my work is really focused on this question of attention and perception. And like Angélique, I actually come from the performing arts, and I was trained as a theater director. And I worked in Europe, and I started in the 1990s, I started to get more interested in breaking down the kind of forms of control that the theater had historically set up. And Germany is a perfect place to do that because they invented the director, the notion of a director. And at the time, I was starting to look at the kind of interactive media arts that were emerging. This was in the mid-1990s. And I started, this is more interesting than the kind of hierarchical structure of the German theater that I was working in. And so I started to think about how might we not work with actors' bodies, but how might we work with public? Very much kind of like David Stark's body. And so I started to try to design spaces. I started this group Sponge in California, and we started to try to think about what are the limits of the vehicle or the genre of theater, and where can we go with that in terms of these new kinds of possibilities of interaction. And so basically, I gave up working with actors. I said, oh, actors are just too psychologically complicated. I want to work with machines, and the public. And in a way, try to create more like certain kinds of situations and spaces where people would respond very physically to those conditions. And so it was about trying to move away from the kind of control models that were traditionally structured in the theater into something else.
If I can add one thing that we may not get to in the context of the conversation here, but I think is important to pop, just kind of have hovering in our conversation. For me, because the moving body is really like I said, it's as much the content as it is the vehicle. The politics of movement and the politics of the body are super important.
Yeah.
And so the body has its own, charge. It's a kind of locus of political, social activity. And I think certainly in the context of the way the body relates to machines, which bodies relates to which machine, et cetera. I just want to throw that out there, and we'll see if we get back to it. But I think it's a
really important point. And as I was thinking, we tend to use this term "the body," but there's an old essay from Catherine Hale. It's called "The Materiality of Informatics," where she says, "Okay, the body as a kind of cipher or a kind of target of surveillance or a kind of target of power can easily disappear. So in informational systems, it can easily vanish, which is, of course, basically what we saw in up until the more recently, where the media arts and the arts involving techne became more and more interested in this question of embodiment and corporality. Early on, it was all about representation and about code and about forms of display and all of this. And so Hale said, well, if you talk about questions of embodiment, we always are in this notion of improvisation and performance and we can change. This very kind of Judith Butler idea of performativity. We can change the scripts of how we respond with our bodies, And so the body is always a kind of complicated thing. So we tend to use that word, but in fact, it's too much of an object that seems fixed. It's fixed culturally, it's fixed in gender, it's fixed in its form of accessing the world. So.
No, very, very interesting, and I like that you have, I would say, almost complementary approaches to the moving body in your work. And I want to maybe push a little bit further what you were saying, David, with this idea of going back to your own body. And I was rereading recently The Construction of Experience, and in that essay you wrote about kind of an anecdote that happened to you in '83 in Vancouver, where the machine would really react really well to you, but when you put the publics in the machine, it would completely break down. And this actually happened to me a few times. And
all of us.
So I thought this was really interesting, and it actually made me wonder, how do you think the interactive machine transform or shapes one's body in the long run?
I had a very intense experience of that around that event. I was working to prepare the work for the first show I'd ever had in '83, and I was working, me and the machine, jumping around in the space, coding the algorithm, jumping around the space, refining the algorithm, jumping around in space, and not realizing until I saw a videotape of myself a month later that I and the machine had converged on what was acceptable movement. the movement that the machine would recognize and the movement I was doing, we came to a point where I could trigger it perfectly, but I was making completely unnatural movements. I was moving with this kind of super spiky sort of movement, and I was initially surprised that members of the general public in Vancouver were not able to trigger the piece, and of course they were not suddenly moving like this when they walked into the space. So it was very much something where my movement was profoundly affected by this collaborative process of working with the machine. The next piece I did, I tried to do the opposite, which was to use algorithms to draw my gestures out into being longer and more extended, as though I was walking in very deep in the ocean, where you can't assume that your body can move in certain ways. You have to deal with the sort of medium that's there. So I mean, that's core to my whole initial practice, was this notion that in these feedback loops with machines, our body is able to be twisted into all sorts of shapes in a sort of compensatory relationship there. It's super important experience for me. Yeah.
So essentially that you became kind of skillful at controlling your own creation, what the public had no experience with.
Yeah, and there's something stranger going on, which I realized as I think more about our relationship with virtuality and virtual objects and things like that, which is that I had another experience at the same time where I made a sound interaction which was using a huge Japanese koto drum sound. And I could only generate it by leaping in the air with all my energy and thrashing in midair. And I threw my back out within about 2 hours because there was no kickback, there was no physical object rebounding that was taking on that energy. And what was happening was I had to also be the drum, right? I had to, because I had to catch my body before I just threw myself out. And so I was carrying all the tension of the imagined physical objects in my body and really doing myself harm. And so that whole thing, but I found myself thinking a lot about the accommodations we make for the virtual things we interact with, which aren't really there. Not just physically, but it also happens mentally. But that, to me, is a super interesting additional aspect of this.
Right. No, that's very interesting. This happened, as you said, in VR, because objects are not physically there. And it's very interesting that you realize that early on by creating those sounds and with non-existent instruments, essentially. Both of you, Chris and David's particularly, you have been working, and Angélique, I think you did too, you've been working on performances for the public, but also participatory performances. And so performances where the public is physically involved. And I kind of want to know if for you there is a difference in your approach in the performance body in the interaction or in the performance where the public is more passive, and how these contexts affects how you work. This one is open.
Well, I'll jump in because I have my response is hopefully fairly concise. For me, I started again with my body and then with the general public, the bodies of the general public, and in that case, that person is within this influencing mechanism of feedback and relationship, and so they're experiencing it in their body, and the story is told through their experience of their body in that. When you use a performer in engaging with an interactive technology, for example, it's a completely different scenario.
Yeah.
And there are two ways to think about it. One, they can be telling a story with their performance about the relationship they have, which is one possibility. The other possibility is that the relationship they're having with the technology is moving their performance in a way it would never go otherwise, may be impossible without the technology, that it draws a performance possibility out of them that would be impossible or improbable otherwise.
Although that's very rare, that kind of toward the...
Yes,
yes,
but
of course, people they seek it. That's the imaginary.
I will not let go of that
No,
dream.
but that's the imaginary people want, you know, and it's interesting to follow up on that, because I've done work both for the stage using interactive technologies and then of course for the public. And the issue with, it's interesting too, because like with the stage, eventually you learn that the performers working with these technologies have a very interesting experience. You know, that it stretches them improvisationally, and they're very aware. I was working with a former dancer from the Ballet Frankfurt, and he was super aware of how acceleration works, and so he knew how accelerometer works. And when it didn't work, you know, when the technology failed, he knew it immediately. So, but for a public, it's very difficult because the classic question is, okay, what's the difference between this person driving this improvisational system, which results in some kind of media sequence of events, and someone who's already programmed that? Can you detect this machinic, imaginary somehow, versus a lot of the earlier work that Sponge did was very much, and even more recently, about wearing sensing and moving and having this physical relationship to effort. And my friend Joel Ryan's written, a computer musician's written a very famous essay on effort and expression. He says, the problem with computing is it's too formal, right? It doesn't have any kind of resistance in it, and we have to build instruments, just like David was saying. To build instruments so we have resistance, because our bodies have resistance. So when we did these early projects like Tea Garden, people had to wear stuff, and they had sensors in them, and they had weight in them, and so as they moved, they triggered things, because there was a physical relationship, and that was more effective because you as you were saying, you're coupled to the machine, you're coupled to the environment, versus the distance of the theater where it's spectacle and it's magic. Anything can happen, and someone's back there programming it, whether they're it's wearing a sensor or someone who's already programmed all those cues. And that question still exists. So many interactive performances on the stage I see, I'm like, well, okay, they spent a lot of time and effort to build these tools, but what did they get out of it? What's the payback?
In my case, I think that we're presuming a situation where I'm not necessarily working with technology. So the idea of public participating is either an interactive situation where there's a back and forth between me as performer or whoever the performer is and the audience member, or alternatively situations where you kind of, you said a little bit what you were describing, Chris, and I think in a way you, David, as well, that the spectator, quote unquote, becomes the performer. Yeah. They engage with whatever dispositive that, we propose, and they become the performer. In both cases, for me, what is critical is how is the notion of improvisation, which is something that we were talking about earlier, and whose improvisation are we talking about? What are the triggers for improvisation? And are we guiding the improvisational result? So is it wide open?
Yeah.
So what are the parameters that we're putting in place? And those parameters, in the context of the work that you two do, might be related to whatever technological support is, or trigger is there. And in my case, it might be the space.
Yeah.
It might be musical. It might be narrative. And it might also be even just physicality. So I think the what is, there's, of course, super well-known Merce Cunningham. That was an improvisational strategy, where the dancers knew physical material, and just before they went on stage, they were told what order it would happen in. So but that's a different kind of improvisation. That is totally valid. I'm not questioning its validity at all. But of course, the kind of improvisation we're talking about now, where it engages the spectator in their own experience, so they have potentially an individual experience of what is going on. And I think that requires a different mindset than if I'm doing something where I, as performer, engage in improvisation, where I'm using, in a way, what I would call a kind of coded language. Even if it's in terms of my physicality, and it might be free movement, it's dancer movement. A spectator is not going to engage with movement in the same way. They don't engage with their corporeality in the same way. So, it really depends on what is triggering what and where we want to go with it.
Can I follow up?
Yeah,
on
of
that?
course, absolutely.
It's really great. I just thought about something. So when I worked in the 1990s with William Forsythe at the Ballet Frankfurt, this is a place where I actually started to become interested in the relationship between technology and corporality. So on one project, Eidos Telos, basically there was what Forsythe called improvisational technologies, which were basically an entire lexicon of techniques, of pulling things in space, of a whole kind of grammar of improv, right? But there were technologies for him because they were about certain forms of regulation and control, you know. And when you watch those pieces in the mid-1990s from Forsyth, I remember my in-laws went to a piece and they were very disturbed by this because they could not find the locus of order, you know. And in fact, there was like this micro, chaos, and then there was this macro structure. And what was interesting, you watch this and you say, how is it possible that any single person could have made this? You know, this is so complex. This is so. There is a structure, but it's like effervescent. It never holds. You know, and of course, what was going on behind the scenes was exactly what Angélique said. It's like there's a form of improvisation. First, of course, these are incredibly trained dancers with ballet already, which is an entirely coded language of control.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You know, and then it was about taking that apart, about deconstructing this. You know, and technology, for instance, technology meaning let's change. There are all these sequences that were coded in terms of time, and then the time clock's running, and suddenly the clock speeds up. So what happens within the constraints of this human and technological apparatus, you know, in which everyone is trying to, every element is vying for attention. You know, and that became very interesting because it shows, of course, the constraints of perception. You know, that the history of dance, is about this, and the history of theater is about the control of perception. You know, and of course, it's about power because in the Renaissance, you know, who gets the ideal seat that sees the perfect vantage point? The king. You know, so this anachronism of the stage. Which is essentially this kind of field of power, is taken apart by and played with by these technologies of control, systems that were designed to actually control things. And this is always the problem people have, I think, also younger artists with these computer technologies, because they think, oh, I'm going to get this, it's going to do all this, it's going to do this. No, this is a system meant to execute a bunch of instructions in no improvisational way possible.
Absolutely.
And we're trying to stretch it, you know, and make it elastic, and the things that our own human bodies and our own perception is, you know. So I think this is very interesting in that we're in this tension all the time, and the stage is the perfect place where that the performative context where this happens, you know.
But I think that's why, as well, the notion of engaging the spectator's body in the process. I mean, in terms of the power relationships of the stage, I mean, we're turning that relationship on its head to a certain extent. You know, maybe this much instead of that much. Yeah. Because, of course, even as you engage with the spectator, depending on what it is you go tickle, what is it? What are the parameters you're giving them? What is the kind of dispositive that is in place? The how much space do you give the spectator to wander? You know, how close, how tight are those parameters? How broad are those parameters? Are they temporal? Are they spatial? Are they musical? Are they narrative? Who decides the narrative? Is the narrative still coming from whoever made it, or are we leaving the spectators? You know what I mean? All of those parameters, and put us in a relationship of, I'm not going to say power, I'm going to say relationships of agency that are shifting and moving constantly. And I think the challenge, keep poking this thing, the challenge is to engage with corporealities with an awareness of the fluidity of the agential relationships. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying. You know, that it really, it's moving all the time. And allowing ourselves to negotiate constantly who has the reins, how much give is there, how much you need to tighten. And I can only assume that when we're working with technology, that stretching that you were talking about, that's where the stretching is happening. You know, how much space are you leaving? Yeah. How much space can the algorithms allow? And what are the limitations inside of that technological possibility as well. I mean, that's also dictating how far the spectator is going to be able to engage, you know?
I mean, the other thing that's dictating how far the spectators are willing to engage is their willingness or unwillingness to take responsibility for an action that may have unintended consequences. And one of the challenges, and then to really engage in that, and that's one of the complicated things, is that performers are often very willing to go there and audience members are not. So trying to find the space where you engage that aspect of the audience with the richness as possible for a performer. There's a space in between there that's hard to negotiate.
Absolutely.
But there's also conventions too, right? Because
Absolutely.
if you say you're going to the theater, I assume I'm going to sit in my seat and someone's going to do the work.
Absolutely.
Why should I do the
Absolutely.
work? You know, but
Yeah.
if they're curious, say, well, why do I have to do the work? You know, versus like you call it an interactive installation.
Yeah.
Then you say,
it's-
okay, I assume I know now what the rules of that are.
Right.
You know, so
Exactly.
now those conventions are quite set. You know, and we're always trying to figure out how to break the conventions. And so part of the merger of forms is about saying, okay, we're trying to like escape the forms of perception that have been inculcated over time and history in particular forms, you know. But it gets more and more difficult because,
increasingly
especially when now people live on a form which is here, you know,
absolutely.
not here, you know.
And there's actually something very interesting with this idea of improvisation, and I think it's very important, especially in dance. It's something that is used a lot and really hard to master, I think. And Angélique, you said something about this idea of triggers in improvisation. And could you explain a little bit more your approach to improvisation?
I mean, again, I think it depends. It's contextual. I think improvisation is a contextual phenomenon in any case. So if I'm working on a project now, for example, where one of the things that we need to do is we're 8 women individually, and we are required to rehearse alone. You go into a public space and you move for an hour. So there's absolutely no prescription in terms of the movement quality or all we know is that it's an hour long and it's in a public space. If you want to just move like this, that's fine. If you want to, agitate yourself all over the place, it's all fine. So I think that even in that kind of context where there are no imposed parameters, I have the possibility, for example, to really think in terms of my own body. Really, what am I feeling? How do the sensations actually generate a next move, a next step? I can play with the space. I can tell myself stories. So I'm actually working with narrative, whatever that is, and allowing that to shift. I can work with really narrowing it down, like I said, still my own body, but really to set, what do I feel? And how do I follow what I feel? As soon as I can engage with whoever turns up around me. So when I talk about space, I'm actually talking about whatever is inhabiting that space, whether it's a tree, a passing dog, or spectators standing and watching. I can also work with the physical makeup of that space. I can work with the temperature. I can work with, all of that is available. As soon as I actively engage another improviser, that the equation changes. Because it's not just me individually engaging with whatever is there. It means that I'm engaging at several fronts. All of that is still present. And on top of that, there is also the deliberate engagement of another body with all of those parameters available to them as well. And so participating in improvisational performances that are happening on a stage is a very different experience than doing an improvisational performance that is happening in public space, where the rules of the game are undefined.
Yeah.
They're undefined. So being in situations where, if I'm on a stage, an audience member, they might engage. I mean, it happens. We know that happens. But they're not necessarily forcibly invited to engage with what's happening. They go and they sit and they watch, And I will engage either with whatever is on stage with me or with the other people involved with what's going on with me. As soon as I'm in a public space, it becomes participatory.
Of course.
precisely because we have changed the parameters. We haven't said anything different to anybody, but we've taken away the code of the box, whether it's a black box or the white cube of a gallery or whatever. And by taking away those codes, these kind of quiet, tacit understandings that we have of how we should be engaging with what we're seeing, these constraints of perception, then all of a sudden it opens up spaces, loads of interstitial possibility that I think, you need to either very consciously say, okay, we're putting it in this space because we want to engage with that interstitial possibility. If you don't want to, then you have to put it in a different context. And I think improvisation with that perspective is automatically something that is going to include in some way the spectator.
And I could actually presume that if an improvisation partner, changes the parameters entirely because that other person improvising also has all that baggage coming
Of course.
with them. What if the improvisation partner is a machine? So when you improvise with a machine, what kind of switches happen in those parameters and those triggers that you're referring to?
I mean, of course, it'll depend on the machine. Again, and I think that whether a machine. I mean, I can improvise with in response to light, for example, that can be triggered by a machine. I think the process is different, and the process is different in the sense that I am in a way the machine then has agency in the context of what we're engaging in together, and that's a different relationship. It's a different relationship, and I'm aware of that relationship. I'm very aware of the fact that I am not with I'm with a different kind of embodiment.
Yeah.
And that reflects, reflects is not necessarily the right word, but it certainly sends a certain kind of resonance to my relationship with my corporeality. That shifts. If I'm outside in a park or on a street corner with other people and cars and dogs passing by, that's a very different set of parameters.
It's a far more complex situation than working with.
There's a kind of, purity is not the right word, but it kind of, you whittle it down. When I'm dealing with a machine, I'm focused on what that change is about. And how that change, am I mirroring? Is it, what is it provoking in me? But it's a much tighter relationship, I want to say. It's something that's much more circumscribed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I spent the first couple of years working on my interactive sound installations thinking about improvisation all the time. Because in a limited way, writing an algorithm is writing a field of possibilities, creating a field of possibilities that will unfold. They are very constrained. They're within the specific limits of the system, that sensing system and the output system that you developed. But it is, in a sense, maps some of what an improviser does. But what's certainly very different about a machine improviser and a human improviser is that boundedness. I mean, the machine does not step outside of the bounds of its programming, whereas another performer can suddenly bring in a whole other world.
Right, or there's a traffic accident.
Right, which I think
absolutely.
But what you're talking about the circumscribedness is very much about that. And that's one of the things I find in the broader context of the whole notion of artificial intelligence, about the limits on it, is this question of the jumping outside of context and adding new things into the mix spontaneously in response to a scenario, which is something that systems are not so good at. It's not impossible to engineer that, but it's difficult to do it in a convincing way.
Yeah.
And maybe as a last question, and I think it's going to be maybe not totally answered, but since the early days of machines and AI, if we go back to the 50s and 60s with the good old-fashioned AI and the symbolic AI, machines have always lacked embodiment. They're working on data, on decontextualized representation symbols. today we have machines that go faster and faster with that and AI that can give us incredible results. I mean, I've recently worked with compositional machines that produce music that is harmonic and seems like it's been composed by humans. Do you think we're surpassing that lack of embodiment in machine with the speed and sophistication of computers? Or do you think achieving intelligence would be impossible without an understanding and experience of the real world by the machine itself?
It's a hugely important,
provocative question.
We might not finish that today.
But
right?
I have a response to it, just because I've been thinking about that question. So I just wrote an essay on GPT-3 and these language models, something that David's worked on a lot, and trying to think about a very simple question that Lyotard actually asked in the 1980s. He had an essay where he said, "Can thought exist without a body?" Right? And clearly, so with these language models, they produce something that looks like human language. You say, wow, and they're very sophisticated in how they do this because they have access to this enormous corpus now that 20 years ago they didn't on the internet. And so they produce something that looks like language. They don't understand language. They just generate it, right? But as humans, we attribute meaning to that, and we say, oh, okay, and we want the machine. We
can't help it.
project our vision into that machine that this is like us, Wow. I think one of the real problems with the kind of question of machine intelligence is that we're still caught up on, because we have this God complex, of just wanting these damn machines to be like us. If we would just give this up and just say, these are entities like mushrooms and flies and bugs and frogs and walruses, and which we don't know how they work, and and we try to understand them, we would be a lot better off. But this intellectual, political, economic baggage we have from long before the development of digital computing, to believe that a machine, and it goes back to Al-Jazari, it goes back to mechanical automata, it goes back. The Greek theater is all about the machines saving the stupid humans, like the Deus Ex Machina coming down because the humans screw everything up and the machine saves everything. So there's this God complex that just keeps going on. If we would just give this up, if we stop anthropomorphizing machines, we stop trying to compare machines to human intelligence and say these things are doing things that we have no idea about, And so much is about like the debates in AI, it has to be explanatory, and well, the frog isn't explanatory. Why is the frog? And the frog is a complex organism. The egret is a complex. Why those don't explain themselves to us? But I think there's this sense that we constantly want to make these things in our own image, as opposed to saying, okay, this is something. Something that our friend Takashi Kagami says is, the machines are way beyond us. Whenever we see the results of a machine, it's the human bottleneck. It's brought down to 2 and 3 dimensions. He's being provocative, but it's brought down to 2 and 3 dimensions, whereas the machines are working in multiple dimensions, in n dimensions, but we can't perceive n dimensions as human beings. Some mathematicians can conceptually. So I just think, it's this anthropomorphism which just gets us in this constant field of problems, as opposed to going, all right, these things are not us, they're other entities, and we've of course built them, but
is that not the crux of it?
That's the problem.
That's the crux of it.
We built these things.
We didn't make the frog or the egret.
Exactly. Yeah, we've built these things.
But there's another facet to this question I wanted to get at, which is that, because actually there's not necessarily much symbolic going on in a deep learning system, for example.
Yeah, that's correct.
And in fact, if you dig into what's going on into hidden layers of a deep learning system, there's a remarkable amount of nuance going on, and that nuance feels different, feels honestly more like something my body might do than something my brain is doing. I don't want to say it's not embodied, but there's something going on there that has a different texture and a different character. And what we do is in the input, we put human known things, especially things we can digitize, images, sounds, whatever. And the output, we want answers.
Yeah.
And so we've declared the in and out, and we're losing an appreciation for what is kind of really unique and different about what's going on inside there. How that relates to the body is a whole other question, which is, again, a huge and hugely important one, I think. But even the fact that we ask for answers out the end of these systems is, again, to me, that's stepping away from the body and towards control. It's like, and it always feels like that's the battle, right?
It's about optimizing
Yeah,
it too. It's to get to the answer as fast as possible.
Right.
You know, and what's so interesting, David and I talked about this before. Is this interesting thing is that many of these deep learning systems have an incredible difficulty with dealing with time. You know, and time is in living systems. That's the only thing that really sustains living systems is the finite time.
Exactly.
The machines are infinite. The Turing machine can go on and on and on forever. You know, because it has all the time in the world.
Yeah, and that's profound. And then it ties into the question of how much is, so there's intelligence, then there's meaning, and then there's, but it seems like by being bound in bodies, we are linked to time in a way that forces us to find meaning.
Absolutely.
Therefore, human intelligence within time. And so if a system is beyond time in that sense, it's not going to have an intelligence that we can relate to in that sense because we are so bound to the timely progression of things.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, like, oddly enough, the dynamics of the brain, it's a time machine. The brain produces time, and that's what drives intelligence, which is funny because a lot of the models are all about, removing all that, just getting as fast as possible, as I said earlier, getting fast as possible to our desired response. So it's I think, and I think this is one of the gaps still in a lot of engineering visions of the world, right? Is that this is left out. If we want to make artificial systems that live in the world, as entities in themselves that sustain themselves, they don't just optimize themselves, then we have to come up with a completely different way of understanding those systems. And I don't see that. I see that happening in certain quarters, but it's not the dominant paradigm.
Yeah,
it's hard.
It's really
That's why
hard.
it's hard. And so the way you get your papers published in artificial intelligence is not by throwing yourself at the hardest problem you can find.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's one of the fun things about being an artist is you can sometimes find ways to justify throwing yourself at the hardest problems you can find and thrashing away for 40 years.
Right. That's what Cage said. He's like, well, Schoenberg said to him, you're an amazing inventor, but not a composer. You have to work on your harmony. He goes, well, I don't have any interest in harmony. And Schoenberg said, well, you're going to be banging your head against the wall for the rest of your life. And he goes, well, I guess I'll just be banging my head against the wall the rest of my life.
Much like Peter Weibel's conception of the image, where there is the flow and the meaning behind the image, gestures have also those two different aspects. So essentially there is the sensorial aspect of gesture and the semantic aspect of the gesture. And I wanted to know, essentially, do you think a machine can give meaning to a gesture or transform the meaning of certain gesture, either by adding some components like sound, like moving images, to certain gestures, or maybe transform a gesture that is purely sensorial into a meaningful gesture?
So it's interesting. So there's always this tension with machine systems in terms of, let's say, in terms of tracking a gesture versus recognizing a gesture. So in order to recognize a gesture, so this is what a classifier does in an AI deep learning system, you have to give it examples of what that gesture is. So that assumes that there's a fixed number of gestures in the world. And so you'd think, well, that's a really limited way of thinking about the world. Whereas tracking a gesture, like, okay, I'm looking at continuous gesture. So one is about discrete, one is continuous. So you kind of say, well, continuous, that's much more improvisational, it's more possible. There seems to be an open field there of possibilities, whereas the other thing assumes that the world has a kind of defined set of things, and things that don't fit in that don't work. But if you think back at a very old text, I was thinking about the Natya Sastra, which is the Indian dramaturgy, which was written in 800 BC, which outlines the entire dramaturgy of Indian performance forms, of music, of dance and of theater. And it outlines every gesture, every mudra. So a mudra is basically a sign, that represents some symbol. Every raga, every pattern structure for music. It literally is like a software manual. It codifies an entire cosmology of the world in that book. And it's still used. It's still how you train Bharatanatyam dancers, it's how you train Kathakali dancers, it's how you do classical Indian music. This is incredible when you think about this, that these traditions have not been changed over this enormous period of time. At the same time, you think about basically 2 game controllers, just to jump. The Kinect controller that came out from Microsoft in 2010 and the Wii controller that came out in 2006. So the Wii controller had an accelerometer. It was the most successful game controller at all time. And the thing about that controller is, it ended up in people's televisions and in their windows and, and all these kinds of things. But because people were so engaged physically, it's almost like that thing disappeared, And it had no model of a gesture because it's taking acceleration. It's just looking at physics. It's looking at the forces of the world. When the Kinect came out, this was of course the Wii killer because it wanted to get rid of this. It was saying we're going to get rid of this controller. You're free in your body. I mean, David knows this. He built systems like the very nervous system that did this. You're free. You can move, but you're actually constrained because you're constrained in 2 ways. One is you can't move out of the field of this IR camera, but the second is what they did is they actually recorded people moving around the world and trained an a deep learning system to recognize the different pose moves. And then when this system would see you move, it would go in that database in the controller and in the software and basically find that model. Yeah. So in fact, it's very strange because it knows the world, but it knows a very, very limited world that it's looking at. So there's an interesting tension between like the codification of gestures in order to create some experience, and then this continuousness where there is no model of the world in the machine.
And there's a real fragility to the semantic modeling there. And if you want continuous response, I mean, you have a problem there automatically.
Totally.
I mean, totally. I find myself, as always, interested in the middle space. I've been obsessed with, and I've never found the right way to make the piece I want to make about where the language meets the body. I've done a whole bunch of etudes that are about trying to get at this question. But to me, that's really interesting, is the struggle between the body and its continuous relationship to the world and language, which in so many different ways impinges on or invited or forced to engage with the body in the semantic world. And that to me is a fascinating area of conflict, ripe for artistic exploration. So I'm not so interested I'm interested in that place where it's muddy. There's lots of places where that continuous experiential part of body movement bleeds into the semantic and things become codified, but they still carry with them also the kind of the pure physiological emotional impact of making that gesture, and those things are muddied. And that to me is, that's really where we live, right? We like to think that we are logical things that move symbols around, and then we're muddied by the fact that we have a body and that they're in conflict. The conflict is us. Yeah. It's not the problem we're trying to solve.
As far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think in my case that this idea of the sensorial versus semantic, I mean, in a way, in a dance context, in the kind of embodiment that we seek and experience, the sensorial is the semantic. You know what I mean? The meaning making is in the affect that is generated as well by that sensorial movement. And so I mean, as soon as you start to think in those terms, then there isn't an either or. The agency as well comes with the doing. The sensation needs to be vitally present in order to generate meaning. So that you can't separate the two. And I think, in a way, I'm certainly curious about this idea of how would I engage with a machine, for example, that could provoke me to enhance my sensorial experience. And that in fact is the meaning making.
Right. Right. So the meaning making in this interaction emerges out of the human perception of
Exactly.
the interaction and the result of it. And I thought that was very interesting what you said also, David, about this the place in the middle, because these things are not discrete. This is a gradient. This is so that moves between the sensorial and the semantic. And maybe I think we have time for another question. And that goes into more your practice, Chris and David, with digital systems, and particularly random number generation and pseudo number random number generation, because when we want to do generative pieces or systems that can spontaneously do stuff, this is something that we fall back on quite often, is the random generation and pseudo random number generation. And I want to have kind of your opinion on the use of these techniques and how close they are to an actual improvisation, and essentially, can those machines improvise?
I mean, it's kind of like the question of any question about intelligence. You have to define what is intelligence, and in this case, you'd have to really define what you qualified as improvisation to answer it completely. But to me, what's interesting there, I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about random number generators and its relationship to infinity and chaos and things like this, not in the 80s pop science way, but the sort of preceding way of thinking about, even just Duchamp thinking about chance as a shot at the infinite, right? This sort of notion. And what it means to use a random number generator that's actually limited versus the infinite, not infinite, but unbounded perhaps inputs available from the entire universe. That's a large and separate question. But in terms of this question, I mean, it makes me think of the quandary I had when I was working on the Giver of Names system that looks at objects and talks about them, a sort of experiment in AI back in the 90s. And there was a moment when I built the grammar system that would generate the words it was going to speak about the objects from just rules of ways words could be put together. And I had that fully formed, but I had no way to trigger it. But I started to think about how it would be triggered, and I realized, my God, in every sentence there are thousands of decisions. Passive voice or not?
Absolutely.
Do I add another
Absolutely.
adjective or not? And why do we make these decisions? And I thought, well, how am I going to have my system make these decisions? It became necessary to invoke a random number generator just to make all these decisions. And then you think, okay, when we're speaking, we find ourselves falling into a habit of speech and things. That's when our random number generator is picking amongst a bunch of things, because we don't really intentionally care which of those we do. So I think of the random number generator in the context of those machines as being just a necessary thing for it to do its thing. And I don't think of it as improvisation. I think of improvisation as there has to be some other intention involved, and a different kind of risk involved.
Yeah.
And there's no risk in just doing, kind of probabilistically following and filling out your algorithmic scorecard, right? It's a different thing, and that risk and.
But that's interesting what you said, because the language models are very much the second thing about, there's a probability, and it's like, okay, it knows something about what came before, and now it's going to try to figure out what's going to come next. But all of the kind of hesitancies and intentions that human communication has, at which we use verbal language as one of those, are not present in those models.
Yeah. One of the amazing things about building language models, working with them, building systems that speak, is that you have a totally different confrontation with intention.
Yeah.
And that's when I'm working with GPT-2 a lot right now, and so frustrated about the lack of intent, the possibility to use intention.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things, the Giver of Names was a terrible image recognizer, and I mean, it's put to shame by things that we can do now in the similar realm. But it did have a model of intention. It looked at objects, and it it didn't have intention, but I had done a lot of thought about what intention meant.
Yeah.
And so it was guided. And trying to now, I'm so bound when I'm trying to work with GPT-2, going, I want to shape and guide, I want to give it reasons to make these choices, not just the past. They all look to the past. Everything is what we just did,
what you just
not
did,
what do
not
I
what we
want to
want you
do.
would do, yeah.
And so
And that's again
huge,
that's that kind of like forward trajectory of
and it's interesting that we're using our body
exactly,
to express that.
Yeah,
It's
exactly,
reach.
exactly.
It's reaching, right?
Yeah.
It's predictive ability almost, rather than, yeah.
Right, and
Back
that's,
on it, yeah.
I often harp about artificial desire. It's the biggest problem. How do we create artificial desire? Intelligence is we
absolutely.
can play with, but if we don't have a way to
Yeah.
actually have a free and open and unbounded, maybe that would be dangerous too, but it's a question, how do we give something the ability to want something enough to find new ways to approach a problem, for example, rather than just being constrained by its definition?
I mean, Alex and I, when we did this project in Barcelona, this project with these spiking neurons and this tower of lights, and we just had 5 moving lights. And the problem always thing with moving lights is they're just very mechanical, right? So they do a perfect 180 turn, but it always feels machinic, right? So we knew that if you just throw a random number generator, you're just going to get the just this kind of thing, So we started using those models of those spiking neural networks. And what's interesting about those is they again produce this kind of spiky time like neurons do, but very different than the feed-forward neurons in artificial neural networks. It's a very different, because it's literally producing these bursts, and those bursts are coming at different rates, and depending on how these neurons connect to each other, like they do in the brain, so you start getting very interesting quasi-periodicity. You start getting things that are steady, but then have this kind of noise in them. And so much about, again, living systems is there's noise in them,
absolutely.
And so then what happened is and then of course you do theater. You change the quality of the light. You do all this. You create a certain scale of image that's 7 or so meters tall. And then basically these spiking neurons control just this movement. And these lights had this kind of objective of staying in alignment with one another. But the neurons constantly cause a kind of noise in the system. So you start getting something that feels more and more, you say, alive. It feels lively in this sense, And it's not, you see there's a structure, and I show this video of this performance to people, and they said, yeah, there's a structure, but yet there's something
else.
lively about it. They don't say human, but there's something that does not feel mechanical. And that's achieved by a system that is not just basically random numbers, but by a more complex form of organization,
But and I think this idea of liveliness, and I like the word. It seems lively. It doesn't seem alive.
Yeah,
I was
really not the same
particularly using
thing.
And
Yeah,
I really
same
like that. But and just maybe to follow up on what's been said, and regarding this idea of liveliness, do you think that kind of unpredictability, or not randomness but pseudo randomness, is a necessary component in the system to infuse a kind of liveliness, or this idea of a behavior that could emerge?
So almost the most interesting thing to play with in something like GPT-2 is the temperature parameter, which, as far as I'm concerned, is basically introducing noise. And that introduces a kind of crazy, it just expands the range of possibilities enormously. I think similarly, I've been obsessed with this notion that which is, I won't go into the background with Ludwig Boltzmann, but there's also the Boltzmann machines, of course, in artificial intelligence, but the notion that we sometimes, I think, when we're confronted with a challenge, we get hot. Like we get angry, we get hot, and it's almost like it generates. It's almost like it generates enough noise that we jump out of a local minimum, right? That's our way of dealing with it. Is we get hot, right? We introduce noise. It's it's one of the ways we are unbounded in a sense, and the body is saving us there in a sense from being trapped by the logical flow of things that got us trapped, and we just get angry and we noise ourselves out of it.
But I'm interested as well in the fact that I don't have any answers, I only have comments, because this part of the discussion is not my turf at all. But
But you
even in
definitely
your
know when you get
question,
hot, right?
I introduce loads of noise. I'm into introducing loads of noise. But I'm also really interested, Marc-André, in the way you phrased the question, which was even to say, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned something about as if to generate or to create some kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And that for me speaks mountains as well, because in a way, which came first, the chicken or the egg, is this idea that you were mentioning, David, of wanting somehow, intention to be more present. Again, it's this anthropomorphizing of the machines that we make, so that they'll do what we do. Maybe with a projection for it to be better or more efficient or faster or whatever. But it's still this idea that, how do we make them do what we do? Behavior is not something a machine does. We can teach a machine behavior. But in a way, the even when I hear you talk about the random, can the machines improvise? In a way where it takes me is, can what the machines do generate improvisation? And that's a different question.
Yeah.
And I don't mean improvisation in terms of, some kind of performance thing. I'm really thinking improvisation in a wider sense.
Can they do something that they have not been
Exactly.
programmed to do?
Is there something in that?
Is it that, or is it, can they bring us to do something that
we have?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Both are valid.
Yeah, so we're not programmed to do.
That we're not programmed to do. That's right. So
Because
we do that even without machines.
yeah.
Yeah.
But arguably technology does it in a different way than we do
very
to each
different
other.
way. Very different
There's a
way.
kind of there's two paths there. There's the very culturally accretive path that we have to solving things, and then there's this very different, the extreme of engineering path. When you have, say, an automated engineering system that finds optimized possibilities, which, like an optimized wheel that does not represent anything that has come through the history of wheel making, and yet is an extremely good answer.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of beautiful to think of the dialogue between those spaces, where you have these layers of learning and building upon ideas, and then sometimes short-circuiting it with this, wait a minute, we can throw some of that out and find a different way. I mean, that's an interesting space of co-improvisation, in a sense, between a very a system that is both respectful and knows history and the history of culture, and is also not afraid of saying, but maybe there are times when through this we can actually then dump that in, and it comes out in a totally new way.
And I think it's interesting because we're constantly in the conversation too. We're talking about, like, there's these extremes, and most people want to play on the extremes. They want to play either on, like, it's all about culture and machines are evil, or machines are saving the world, are the savior of the world. There's never. It's very difficult to find this middle ground where people are not not technophobic and not technophilic.
Absolutely.
It's not. It's a hard place to stay in the middle of, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
It's a lubricated hill where trying to stay balanced on top is difficult. But to me, it's the interesting.
That's the most interesting space.
Yeah.
So thank you once again, Angélique, Wilkie, for agreeing to be with us today. David Rockerby, it was a pleasure. Chris Salter again. That was a fascinating discussion. For you all at home, it's not over. You can go to rencontre.hexagram.ca to have all the available content that was broadcast at the Ars Electronica Festival 2021. Thank you, and have a good day, everyone.